let's get started. So in this video we'll talk about the most fundamental core concepts of Java. We'll discuss objects and classes. So what is a class, what is an object, what's the difference when we use class or object. Okay, so by this time it's supposed that you have an environment set up. So you have an Eclipse, Java SDK, everything is configured to work together. If you have not done that yet, so on the right top corner you should see a link to a video. So it's a kind of manual how to do that. So please watch it if needed. Also, it's supposed that you know what is a variable, what are primitive types of variables available in Java, so you are quite confident how to create a variable, how to work with it. If not, once again, on the top right corner you should have a link to a video where you can learn about that. But other than that, let's start. Okay, so what is a class? So a class could be defined as some kind of structure, which defines a set of data or data structure, and also some actions or manipulations which could be done with these data structures. Right? So for example, here we have an example. Here it is a definition of class rectangle. So as you can see, we have two variables of type float defined. So that's our data structure for the class, and also we have three methods or three actions defined for this class. So the first one is a constructor. So that's a special type of method. Any class should have at least one such method. So about constructors we'll talk about in details in the next video. Just for now, you should remember that each class should hold at least one constructor, and this method is needed to create an object out of a class. Okay, and two other methods which allows us to manipulate with data structures of the class. So for example, we have a method or action area which, using these two variables, computes an area of this particular rectangle. So the same applies to perimeter method. So based on the values of these two variables, we somehow manipulate the data and get the perimeter of a rectangle. Okay, so that's about a class. So that's a structure of data or variables and some actions or methods which allow us to manipulate with these data structures. Right? And from classes, let's jump to objects. So object could be defined as a given implementation of a particular class. Right? So here we see two objects, rectangle 1 and rectangle 2. These are two implementations of a class rectangle. Right? So here you can see, for example, that we have some variables, side1 and side2, inside of the class, but they are not defined. Right? So we don't have any particular values of these variables available here. But if we move to objects, so then we have a particular implementation of a given class, then all variables are defined. Usually it is done using constructor, like it's shown here. So don't afraid. So we'll talk in details about constructors in the next video. So just for now, as it was said before, constructor is needed to create an object out of a class. Okay, Okay, so once we have an object, so for that purpose we need first to define a variable to store a link to this particular object, and also pay attention that the type of this particular variable, in our case it's rectangle 1, it should have the same type as a class for which we create an object, right? So we create an object of type rectangle, so that's why the type of this variable rectangle1 should be rectangle, right? And once we have done that, we can call any methods defined within a class, like area and perimeter. So the same applies here. We create a second object of the type rectangle, so the variable is of type rectangle with a different sides, so different values of the class variables, and then we can also use all methods defined for a particular class. Okay, so that's all about theory. I really want to keep it short, and let's get our hands dirty, so to say, with Java. So let's jump into Eclipse. So here we should have a project from our previous video related to variables, types of variables or primitive types. So we can delete everything from here. So we should have only empty main method. And let's create a new class. Let's define a new class rectangle like we have here. Okay. So as you remember, it's a good practice to keep each class in a separate file, right? So let's create a new class. So we do that by double right-clicking on the package and selecting new class. Okay, so let's call it rectangle. Okay, let it be public, so we can create any objects out of this class, calling constructors from outside of this particular class. Also, as you might remember, in the previous videos we used this public static void checkbox because we need to have such a method if we want to make our class executable. For rectangle it's not applicable, so we don't want to run a program out of the rectangle, so we don't need to check it. Just let it as it is. Okay, rectangle, finish. Okay, so here we have a file of our new class rectangle. So everything what is written inside these brackets is supposed to be class variables and class methods. Okay, so let's start by defining these variables as we have here. So it's float side 1 and float side 2. Okay, so let's skip constructor for now because we'll use it or talk about constructors in general in details during next video. So let's not touch it for now, and let's define these two methods or actions which could be done with our defined structures, right? So the first one was area. Okay, public float area. Okay, so let's talk a bit about method definition. So what are these keywords about? So the first one, we see a keyword public. So what public means is that this method could be called by any other methods or object. So another option is to use private, and in that case this method could be called only by other methods of this class or object, right? So if we define it as a private, this method could be called only by this object created out of this particular class, right? And the third option to use here is a protected. That's something in between. So if we define method as a protected, it means that this method could be called by any class inside a given package. But still, we'll talk about that in details a bit later. So just for your information, most of the methods are public ones. Okay, so the second keyword is a type. And this type means what is the result of running this method. What is the result of executing this method? So in this case, it's defined as float. That means that the result of running this method area is a number of type float. So actually here we can use any type we want. So in general, any type could be used here. Either it's a primitive type or it could be a class, right? So no restrictions here. But just to remember that here we just put a type of returning value of the method. So what is the result of running this particular method? On the third position, here we actually have a name of the method, right? So in our case it's area, and here in the brackets, if applicable, we should mention all input parameters or input data required for this method to work. So in this case we don't need any input data because all data structures defined within a given class are accessible by all methods within the same class, right? So from area we can easily access these variables. So we don't need to mention them as input parameters, right? And finally, we should somehow write a code to state what this method should return, or what is the result of running this particular method. So that's why now we have an error, and Eclipse is highlighting that this method must return a result of type float. So right now we didn't define that. Okay, so that is done by using a keyword return. So we specify what the value will be returned. And as you all know, so the area of rectangle is a multiplication of both sides, right? Okay. So of course, if our method is more complicated, we can have some other code here, but always the last command or last instruction of each method, if it is supposed to return something, should be return and the value, right? Okay, let's similarly define another method. Okay, return, it's side 1 plus side 1 plus side 2 and plus side 2. Okay, that's a parameter. Okay, so we have defined our class. So we skipped constructor for now. Okay, but what we should know for now, that each class, even if we don't define it explicitly, has a constructor, a default constructor, which will be used now by us to create an object with the type rectangle. New rectangle. Okay, so believe me or not, but we have just, with this command, created a new object of type rectangle. Okay, and once we have this rectangle, so the variable angle 1, we also have access to methods which are defined for a class, right? So we have access to variables first of all, right? Side 1 and side 2, and also we have access to methods. So it's area and perimeter. Also we have other methods defined which are not mentioned here. So why it happens, we'll talk later when we'll touch a topic called inheritance, right? But for now you should remember that each class actually has more methods available than it's defined in the class, right? Because of inheritance. Okay, so that would be all for today. Right, so today we briefly discussed classes and objects in Java. What is a class, what is an object, what is the difference between them, and how we can create a class, how we define it, and how we create an object out of a class. So next time, in the next video, we'll talk about constructors of a class. So what is a constructor, how we can define it, whether we can or we cannot define multiple constructors, and so on. But that's all for today. Thanks to all for watching. If you have any questions or comments, you are welcome to post them below the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that yet. Other than that, thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye bye.